Hello and welcome back to Kim Reads, the continuous secret of Seattle Ranch. Chapter 4, A Red Clue. Nancy jerked one arm free from the attacker and fumbled for a light switch. Her fingers found it and the ceiling lamp on the dining room table went on. Clinging to her was Mrs. Thurman, the cook. She wore an old-fashioned nightgown and her head bristled with curlers. She let go of Nancy like a hot branding iron. "You!" she exclaimed. "Yes, me," Nancy replied, suppressing a smile. "I'm surprised as you are, Mrs. Thurman." "What's the matter?" demanded Ed Raleigh as he and his wife, wearing robes and slippers, hurried from the living room. Then Bess and George ran from the portico with Alex behind them. "Nancy, are you all right?" Sue Walt Sanders and Nightcliffe rushed into the kitchen. A moment later, Tex and Bud clumped in. Nancy wondered where Dave and Shorty were. "Bud and I were on watch," said the red-haired cowboy, "and we're checking the stable when we heard the ruckus." "What's up?" Mrs. Thurman told her story. She had been asleep in her room, a small extension of the kitchen, when she had been awakened by someone coming to the kitchen through the screen door. "I sleep light," she explained. "First, I was unable to move. I listened hard, but I didn't hear any more, so I decided to get up and take a look. Just as I stepped out of my room, what do I see but a screen door opening and a dark figure stepped in, so I jumped him and hollered." Nancy smiled. "And I was him." Then she said, "There was an intruder here, Mrs. Thurman, because I saw him come in." "He must have gone to the living room then," said Mrs. Raleigh. "There's no other way out." Mrs. Thurman shook her head. "No, ma'am," she said forcefully. "The door to the living room squeaks and I didn't hear a sound." George moved the door and the hinges made a noise. "Then where did the intruder go?" Bess asked shakily. Nancy's keen eyes had spotted a trapdoor beside the old-fashioned stove. "Perhaps down there?" "If he did," Ed Raleigh said grimly, "he's caught. That's the cellar. This is the only way out." "Dave," he ordered, looking beyond Nancy. "Come with me." From behind her stepped the tall cowboy. He was fully dressed and carrying a flashlight. She turned and saw Shorty Steele standing inside the screen door. He, too, was working his clothes. When had they arrived, and why hadn't they gone to bed after coming off patrol duty? As Ed Raleigh lifted up the trap door, Nancy said, "I'd like to go too, Uncle Ed." The man hesitated, then said, "All right, but you stay well behind us." The cowboy turned on his flashlight, and Nancy followed the men down a flight of wooden stairs. She found herself in a shallow cellar which was empty except for a row of shelves against one wall. At Nancy's request, Dave held his light downward so he could look for footprints, but the earth floor was hard-packed. She could see no marks on it. When the trio returned to the kitchen and reported no sign of the intruder, the cook just shook her head. "He was a phantom," she declared, "just like the horse." "Now, Mrs. Thurman," said Aunt Bet, "maybe you were excited you didn't hear the intruder go through the living room door." The little woman looked indignant. "I have excellent hearing," she stated, "and that door positively did not squeak." Nancy found it hard to doubt Mrs. Thurman's word. The young sleuth turned to Dave. "Did you come from the bunkhouse?" "No," Dave said quietly. "I was doing some extra investigating." Whatever that means, Nancy thought. She noted that Shorty said nothing. Mr. Raleigh did not query the men. A few minutes later, everyone back to bed except Tex and Bud. Nancy awoke at dawn and puzzled over the problem. Who was the intruder? What was he after? Where had he gone? Quietly, she arose and dressed, and then went to the kitchen to make herself a cup of tea. Not wanting to heat the big kettle of water which stood in the old-fashioned range, she took a small pot from the hook on the wall and carried it to the sink. She turned one of the faucet handles, but no water came out. Surprised, Nancy tried the other with the same result. "That's strange. I'll ask the girls about it." She hurried to the bedroom and woke them. Bess and George said this had not happened before, and George went to tell her aunt and uncle. In a short time, the hastily dressed rancher appeared completely puzzled. He led the way past the stable and the corral to a small frame bed. Inside were an electric generator and pump. After examining the machinery, Ed Raleigh said one word. Sabotage! He showed the girls where some of the bearings were missing. We'll need new ones before we can get any water. It's a shame, George declared. When do you think this mission was done, and where were the guards? What difference does it make, her uncle said with a sigh. The man can't be anywhere at once. What about Chief? Nancy asked. He didn't bark at the saboteur. Does this mean he knows him? Ed Raleigh's jaw tightened. I'd trust Sanders, Bud, and Dave with my life. They came highly recommended by friends of mine, and as for the others, I accuse no man without proof. Nor would I, Nancy said quietly and began looking for evidence. On the wooden floor were damp daubs of red earth. Outside the building was a wet patch of the same color, but the prints were too confused to be distinguishable. Whoever damaged the pump may still have this kind of mud on his boots, Nancy thought. The rancher's face was grave with worry. This pump will have to be fixed as soon as possible. After the windmill in the east meadow was wrecked, I had to start using this pump, which only supplied the house to water my cattle. There's another mill in the big meadow, but its supply is enough for them. We're lucky to have one other source of spring water. The three girls volunteered to carry water to the kitchen. They went to get buckets for Mrs. Thurman, who was pale and tight-lipped. She handed them kettles and large pots. Bess led the way around the house to the spring house, a windowless adobe structure built under the back wall of the kitchen. George opened the heavy wooden door, and the girls stepped down on the earthen floor. It was cool and so dim they could barely see the small stream of water coming from a pipe to the center. While waiting on her turn to fill the kettle, Nancy went outside to look around. She saw that between the ranch house and the foot of Shadow Mountain ran a heavy strip of woods which continued along the big meadow. That's where the phantom horse is supposed to appear, Nancy reflected. Just then, Bess came from the spring house. Your turn, Nancy, she called. The young sleuth hurried inside and placed her kettle underneath a stream of water. While waiting for it to fill, she noticed a stone vat against the kitchen wall. It was about 3 feet square with a hinged wooden lid. That's where the old-timers stored milk products and eggs, she thought. When Nancy reached the kitchen with her full kettle, Mrs. Thurman was serving breakfast. As the girls sat down, Dave and Shorty came in. Nancy glanced at their boots. There was damp red mud on both pairs. As soon as the men finished eating, Dave stood up. I'm going to Tumbleweed to get pump bearings, he said to Nancy. Mr. Warley said you wanted to do an errand in town. You can ride along with me. Nancy was glad the sheriff had not been mentioned. She said, I'll go, thank you, and I'll bring George. Dave scowled. I'll be at the pickup, he replied abruptly and walked out. Nancy hurried to her room to get the warning notes and the rattle. The pickup was parked in the yard, and as soon as Nancy and George climbed the cab, Dave started it. Without saying a word, he drove out to the ranch gate and turned onto a dirt road which stretched down the valley. The girls appeared to be relaxed, but they could not get rid of their minds of a distrust of Dave. Once he caught Nancy looking at his shoes. Yes, Miss Detective, he said, that's mud from outside the pump house. I was up before dawn this morning, and I thought I'd heard a noise down there. I didn't find anyone, though. Must have scared off the pump wrecker. But he came back later. George asked why Dave was up so early, but he did not answer or speak again until they reached a small town of old-fashioned frame buildings. The cowboy parked the pickup on the main street. I'll meet you there in half an hour, he said as he swung out of the truck. Nancy and George saw him go into a hardware store several doors away. Before them was a building with a sign, Sheriff. As the girls entered the small office, a gray-haired man swiveled around in his chair and rose to greet them. I reckon you're Miss Drew, he said in a pleasant drawl. I'm Sheriff Curtis. His eyes twinkled. Ed Raleigh told me you're aiming to help him find what's causing the trouble at the ranch. George spoke up, and Nancy will too. I sure wish you luck. After hearing Nancy's story and looking at the notes and rattle, I'll hang on to these as evidence and the phone the state and Phoenix lawman to keep an eye out for the hombre you saw at the airport. Keep me posted, he added gravely, and be extra careful, girls. Nancy thanked him, and the callers left. They still had 20 minutes to spare. George said she wanted to purchase a cowboy kerchief in the general store, so Nancy strolled along, looking in shop windows. The town seemed almost deserted, and many of the stores were not yet open. Ahead, in the center of the street, grew a large cottonwood tree with a wooden bench built around the trunk. Nancy walked into it and was able to sit in the shade, when her eye was caught by a tall stack of Indian baskets outside the shop marked Mary Dear, Gifts. Nancy crossed over to look at them and then glanced through the window. Startled at what she saw, Nancy almost cried out. The shop was empty, except for a man with a black kerchief covering his face and eyes. He was crouching in front of an open glass case, scooping the jewelry into a paper bag. Heart pounding, Nancy looked up and down the street for help, but there was no one in sight. Boldly, she stepped to the open door of the shop. Drop that bag, she ordered. With a startled gasp, the man whirled and then charged straight at her. And that's that chapter, Sealy.